right, so we've talked a lot about the demography of the 1950s and the sort of social elements that are going on. We talked about the growth of the economy. So now we want to move on and talk about politics and what's going on. And I've sort of labeled this presentation the liberal decades. I have it noted on our calendar, the Democratic presidents. There's sort of like a little asterisk there. Dwight Eisenhower, of course, served for 8 years, was an incredibly popular president. We definitely liked Ike. And all that business, but I would argue that his presidency, although like nominally a departure from this idea of the liberal decades, didn't really change the course of America. The rise of the baby boom itself is going to play into a bit of this like liberal decades, right? Young people tend more often to identify as liberal. The world experiences of young people, like my dad, for example, who's a baby boomer. I think I've mentioned to you before that he is really, really liberal. And it has a lot to do with the fact that he grew up in my grandmother's household, and she believed that Franklin Roosevelt had saved them from the Great Depression. You know, had framed pictures of Roosevelt and all that business, and so that really influenced baby boomers' worldview. In a lot of ways, Roosevelt was really popular with their parents. Your parents are a large part of your political socialization. This is all a preview of AP Government next year. Congratulations. And so that's going to be sort of play into the way the dynamic of politics at this time. In a similar way to the rise of conservatism in the 1980s, the people who are coming of age politically in the 1980s grew up during the Vietnam War era, right? And the rise of this distrust in the government. So the shift away, so in my opinion, and this isn't necessarily like doctrine here, but in my opinion, I think that the biggest difference between liberalism and conservatism is the level of trust placed in the government, right? Like, do you think the government is a force for good or a force for bad? And again, so those who grew up during the Great Depression, during World War II, and their parents, they're going to really see the government as a force for good. But those people who are forming their ideas about politics during the late 60s and 70s are going to see Watergate and Vietnam and all of these challenges, and they're going to feel like the government is this force for bad, and so they're going to want less government. So anyway, those kinds of dynamics are going on behind the scenes here. But okay, so the liberal decades. So Truman, of course, becomes president in 1944 with the death of Franklin Roosevelt. He's going to preside over maybe it was 45. Now I'm questioning myself. Anyway, it doesn't matter. At the very end of the war, and he'll preside over the end of the war. He's going to support the European reconstruction policies like the Marshall Plan that we're going to be proposing. But domestically, he wants his own legacy in a sense, and he believes that it's going to be important to carry on the ideas behind the New Deal, expanding government programs, creating a social safety net. And so he's going to try to pass his own sort of set of plans that he calls the Fair Deal. But it's not as effective as perhaps he might have liked. So to begin with, he'll be pretty effective using executive action. So one of the most important things we remember that Truman does is immediately at the end of World War II, he's going to issue an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. It's 9981. And it is incredibly controversial. There's this notion that, like, well, it's going to ruin like camaraderie among the troops. It's going to, engage in dissent. They're the kinds of, it's not that we're saying that people of color aren't as capable as whites, but the antagonism between the two and the lack of understanding is going to limit our fighting forces' abilities to be effective. Frankly, it's a lot of the same stuff we're hearing or have been hearing about women in combat, right? And how, like, yeah, maybe they'd be okay, but it's going to ruin the like whatever male camaraderie spirit that we have. And I think that we're hopefully on the way to proving a lot of those ideas wrong. And certainly they did in the 1950s. But nevertheless, he's going to meet a lot of resistance. I think it's kind of telling this front page of the newspaper, right? So President Truman wipes out segregation in the armed forces. And then down just from that headline, the secondary headline here, posse, bent on lynching, searches woods for prey. So this is really the atmosphere that the country finds itself situated within in the 1950s. Truman is going to continue to expand on the Fair Labor Standards Act. The minimum wage will rise, right? It started out as something like 25 or 50 cents an hour, and so that will begin to rise tied to inflation. We do see a lot of inflation, not sort of catastrophic levels like we're going to see in the 70s, but prices are going to be rising after the war because wartime price controls are going to be eliminated, right? During the war, we had the various government agencies in charge of rationing and setting prices and organizing production. But as the government sort of eases off those controls, we are going to see some rising prices, and wages will, in many ways, rise to meet that as part of this like general economic growth that we have. But more generally speaking, or more broadly speaking, Truman's ideas about civil rights and about healthcare are going to be met with a lot more resistance. So he is going to be the first of many Democratic presidents to unsuccessfully propose an expansion of healthcare services for the United States. And the Congress really just isn't having it. In many ways, I think we can see some congruencies between the American government in the 1920s after World War I and American government in the 1950s, because there's a sense like the crisis is over. We don't need, we've done enough. We don't need to bother ourselves. Let's just focus on prosperity. Let's focus on, American strength. And so, we don't want to bother with those other issues anymore. We don't want to bother with more reform. We don't want to bother with more social safety nets. Those are expensive. And frankly, I mean, in the 1930s, right, during the New Deal, many, many, many Americans are experiencing the kind of poverty and destitution that would lead them to support government expansion of social services, right? But in the 1950s, fairly few Americans are going to be experiencing poverty. And so politically speaking, it's significantly more or less popular to advocate for those programs, because there's, people tend to be selfish, right? They're going to vote for programs that will benefit them. And since most Americans aren't going to be in poverty, they're not going to be as interested in expanding some of those programs. So Truman will be elected on his own right in 1948. He'll serve the remainder of FDR's term, and then his own term from 48 to 52. And then in 1952, we're going to see Dwight Eisenhower elected. He wins in a landslide, which I'm sure does not come as a surprise to you, given that he, again, as I mentioned before, basically literally saves the free world through his work as the Supreme Allied Commander. But Eisenhower is, I titled it here, Modern Republicanism. He's kind of going to tick off his own party, although they never say so in public, because you don't want to go against, again, the savior of the free world here. But because he's going to refuse to, for example, dismantle the New Deal. Many Republicans in Congress are going to believe that now that Eisenhower is in place, he's going to, roll back lots of these New Deal programs. He's going to, cut back on executive regulation of businesses and wages, and reduce enforcement of these kinds of whatever. But in fact, he doesn't. He really doesn't reduce the effect of any of the New Deal programs. He certainly doesn't expand them, for sure. But he doesn't eliminate them either. He's going to appoint one of the most influential Supreme Court justices, who's going to really change the course of both civil rights and criminal litigation. Earl Warren will be appointed by Eisenhower. Eisenhower, I don't think, knew that Earl Warren was going to be quite as active as a judge as he turned out to be. Warren being perhaps one of the most activist judges we've seen in a long time, Chief Justices anyway. But on the other hand, Eisenhower was under no misunderstanding. He didn't think that Warren was going to be some sort of super, Scalia figure, right? Some conservative that's going to resist the attempts to change the meaning or the interpretation of the Constitution. So he's going to be very conciliatory, very much a centrist president. We started yesterday's notes with this topic about the military-industrial complex, right? So he's not some sort of warmongering, hawkish president who wants to, build the strength of his party through whatever this sort of heavy-handed means. He, in fact, is going to sort of build on a lot of expansion of the programs. So in 1956, the Interstate Highway Act will be passed under Eisenhower's leadership. He was very strongly impacted by what he saw while he's in Germany during World War II. So he sees the Autobahn, which had been constructed in the 30s by the Nazis primarily, and he saw how effective it was in terms of transporting troops and supplies to meet whatever the challenge was. And so Eisenhower really felt strongly that American transportation was way behind the times, that if we were ever to be attacked, that we, can you imagine, if everywhere you had to go was driving between here and Caldwell? Do you ever got that way? What if all the roads were like that? One lane both directions, and eventually it gets even a smaller road. I mean, that's really what the American transportation system was primarily composed of in the 1952. And so Eisenhower says, we've got to change this. We have got to have more streamlined system. And so the Interstate Highway Act is going to pave the way for, as you can see, here's the interstate highway system that has been constructed. I think this is a 1990 graphic. So these are ultimately coming about. But interestingly, all of the like the standards for the interstate highways are all based on military vehicles. So like the size or the width of like a lane of traffic is based on the width for like troop transporter vehicles and tanks, like that they would be able to use the same, to have people going in two different directions. The like standard height for most overpasses is to like accommodate the tallest military vehicles, that kind of thing. So all of those standards of measurement were really designed to make sure that if we were ever attacked as part of this Cold War atmosphere, that we'd be able to move troops and supplies either away from sources of danger or to meet whatever the challenge would be. I guess I put there, I didn't mention, the 1954, the Democrats take control of Congress, and this helps to explain the sort of moderate record of Eisenhower. He could have been obstructionist, right? In much the same way that I guess you could call President Obama fairly obstructionist of the Republicans in Congress at this time. So Eisenhower could have stood in their way and sort of stopped them from their programs. But as it was, he doesn't really do that. He's going to kind of accept the direction that the nation is headed. So Eisenhower will serve his 2 terms. We know that the 22nd Amendment has been passed, right? So there's now officially a 2-term limit. I think is one of those who could have been elected more if he had wanted to, and if the Constitution allowed, but it didn't. The 22nd Amendment said that the 2 terms was the maximum, and so then in 1960 we're setting ourselves up for this really big political showdown. It's going to really come down between this sort of like political unknown, this freshman senator, in this case from Massachusetts, and sort of an old stalwart, Richard Nixon. Nixon had served as the vice president for Eisenhower. He had distinguished himself in the 40s as a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee going after communists, so he had a record of being really strong against communism. Nixon had politically managed to get himself out of a few jams here and there. While I guess this is the 1956 election, there's some talk, some rumors that he's accepted like improper campaign donations, like from people who are seeking favors while he's helping to campaign for Eisenhower. Right? He's not running for president in 56, but he's the vice president on the ticket, and he's accused of taking these improper donations. And he goes on and gives this really famous, it's called the Checkers speech. And one of the things that he received from donors was a dog that their family called Checkers, and his kids were pictured playing with checkers all the time. And so he gives this speech, and he talks about, if anything is improper, we'll be happy to, meet whatever the requirements are. We can give it back. Like, we're not doing anything that's, untoward, which, frankly, I'm not quite sure I believe at this point, knowing what we know now. But anyway, but then he ends the speech saying, but there's one thing that we're definitely not going to give back. My girls have really fallen in love with Checkers, and we love the dog, and he's not going anywhere. And the country loves him. They're like, oh, and it gets him out of this jam, and the whole thing blows over, which most people didn't expect that it would. So he has weathered a few political storms already, and again, it's really seen as a sort of logical choice, a successor for Eisenhower. Interestingly, you sort of wonder what Eisenhower saw in Nixon that we didn't, because Eisenhower does not really endorse Nixon. He doesn't oppose him either, but Eisenhower doesn't come out, campaigning for the Republican candidate in 1960, and this sort of casts doubt. But perhaps a more important impact on the election of 1960 is the rise of television, right? So the 1960 election is going to be the first where television is like a widespread technology, where most Americans are going to have televisions either in their homes or access to them on a regular basis. And so, for example, the 1960 presidential debates will be the very first that are televised. And in those debates, we're going to really see the difference between, in terms of like PR or like public image, between Kennedy and Nixon. So Nixon refuses makeup before he goes on, right? So you probably know that most people on television, even the men, are wearing makeup, that kind of thing, especially now in like HD camera era, right? So, but Nixon refuses makeup. On camera, he keeps shifting his weight a lot. He has a sort of 5 o'clock shadow that you can sort of see. His eyes look a little bit haggard. He's a little shifty. And Kennedy just appears just incredibly at ease, right? He's young. He was wearing the makeup. He's pretty attractive. He seems very calm and confident. And so people who listened to the 1960 presidential debates on the radio, most of them thought that Nixon might have won or were split. So it wasn't a huge weight in favor of Nixon, but more thought Nixon won if they listened on the radio. But those who watched on television overwhelmingly believed that Kennedy won the debate. And most historians are going to argue that that's a pretty significant factor in Kennedy's popularity. There's some talk about the Kennedy era as the Camelot. He has this young wife, right? We call her Jackie O now, but Jackie Kennedy at the time, who was this beautiful woman. She's like a fashion model. She's incredibly fashionable, I guess, and like cultured. She's there are young children who are just like precious. This little toddler and this little preschooler, and they're gonna go out and make all of these like perfectly manicured appearances. And then even in the White House, it's like America has our own little royal family. And the kinds of the way we see people talking about like Prince William and Kate, and their little kids, is kind of the atmosphere that surrounded the Kennedys during the campaign, and especially once they get into office. So there's this sort of interesting dynamic going on there. But politically speaking, Kennedy is going to have a lot more trouble, right? So, bless you. I think that Kennedy had a lot of really strong ideas, but he's not particularly able to get them through Congress. He's going to take as his vice president Lyndon Johnson, who is from Texas. Johnson had been the Speaker of the House prior to beginning his campaign. So Johnson had also campaigned for the Democratic nomination for president at that point, 1959. Johnson does not get the nomination, right? Kennedy's going to get it. And Johnson has to kind of be finagled into accepting the position of VP. He says something like that the vice presidency isn't worth a warmed over bucket of spit, which kind of makes my skin crawl a little bit to think about a warmed over bucket of spit. But what he meant was that as Speaker of the House, he had incredible power, right? He could influence the kinds of legislation that was going to pass. And the Vice President of the United States has approximately zero power, right? And it didn't help that the Kennedys, so JFK, who's going to be nominated and eventually elected president, and his brother, Robert Kennedy, who will be named the Attorney General, they don't think much of Lyndon Johnson. It had been kind of a bitter campaign, the part of the nomination. Johnson is from Texas. He's a good old boy. He's not cultured. He didn't grow up with all of this, whatever, like Miss Maynard's classes and etiquette, whatever. And so Johnson is ridiculed in the Kennedy White House. He's excluded from most of these big meetings, and he understands that. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic at play there. But he's convinced to go on the ticket because the Democrats are struggling in 1960, right? 1948, we saw the rise of the Dixiecrats. I'm sure you've read about that in your book. As Truman suggests, like desegregating the armed forces, there are these Southern Democrats who are, trying to rebel from the Democratic Party. They nominate their own candidate for president. It doesn't go well for them in the end. But so there's this real need. If the Democratic Party hopes to win, they're going to have to really find a way to unite the South alongside the sort of like more mainstream Democrats. And Johnson is from Texas, which helps. So he was put on the ticket to balance the ticket, and he's convinced really by another congressman from Texas, Sam Rayburn, who's going to say, like, look, Johnson, you've got to take this. You can't say no. This will set you up politically for the future, so you need to say yes now. And so anyway, Johnson does. But okay, so Kennedy, there's also, hopefully we can come back and watch some of these clips, because I think, I don't love Kennedy as a president necessarily, but I think he's one of my favorite speakers to listen to. So his speeches, I feel like, are really inspirational. And the "We Go Choose to Go to the Moon" speech is one of my very, very favorites. It has perhaps my favorite presidential quote probably ever. Mostly I think it's from a teacher. The gist of it is basically that he says, we choose to go to the moon and do all these other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And so he's sort of challenging America that the 1960 election is a kind of crossroads for America. We are frightened of the kinds of threats that we perceive as being very real. The rise of the Cold War, the Korean conflict, which has sort of been resolved in the 50s, but really seems like it's going to boil over. Vietnam is becoming more and more of a conflict as we go closer to 1960. There's worries about the Russians expanding in Eastern Europe. We've got Cuba that has just fallen to communism. China has fallen to communism. There's this sense that America has to be on guard. And Kennedy argues, look, we had this prosperity, but we can't let our guard down. We have to work hard. But he says that in sort of an inspirational way. I'm not sure I'm always good at that, but that's sort of like what I want to say as a teacher, right? Is that like it's really hard, but we can do this, and it's important that we do it because it's going to make us better. And that's Kennedy's message. But like I said, he's not super awesome with Congress. Congress doesn't love him. Johnson doesn't help much. He probably could have helped, but he doesn't because of the dynamic between the Kennedys and the Johnsons. And so all over here on the side, medical care for the elderly, increased Social Security, aid to public schools, urban renewal projects, these are all proposals of the Kennedy administration that just don't happen. To be fair, Kennedy is only in office for 3 years, right? He's assassinated in 1963. But he's really unable to get a lot of the things on his platform, this new frontier, accomplished. He will be effective at starting the space race. He gives the speech, we want to go to the moon by 1960, by the end of the decade, and it's true. America reaches the moon in 1969, despite the fact that the Russians were ahead in the space race for quite a while. They had the first satellite in space, they had the first person in space, the first orbit, all those kinds of things. He's going to establish the Peace Corps, trying to sort of shift the perception of America from like this aggressor abroad to like a bringer of good things. So the Peace Corps puts together American volunteers to sort of go and spread public education and modern sanitation systems and just general, renewal projects around the world in places that were experiencing struggles. This is kind of like the Marshall Plan. You shouldn't read this as just like a philanthropic venture. It's also like, let's make people love America, because there was this fear that global opinion was turning against us. And he will give lip service to civil rights, right? He'll begin to talk about civil rights publicly, which is better than nothing. But many in the African-American community were upset that he didn't go as far as they thought that he would, based on the kinds of discussions they've had with him as he's campaigning. Again, in fairness, he is killed in 1963, and the biggest push for civil rights is to come just a year later. And in fact, the Civil Rights Act of 64 is going to be in many ways sort of Kennedy's brainchild, but Johnson's going to push it through. But anyway, okay, so 1963, Kennedy will be assassinated. Johnson will, of course, become the president, and then will be elected in his own right in 1964. And Johnson is incredibly able to influence congressional politics, because his time as the Speaker of the House meant that he had lots of connections. He is a fairly intimidating guy. Like, I would never have wanted to meet Johnson in a bad mood. And he was known for giving the so-called Johnson treatment. If you didn't want to vote the way that he wanted you to, he would call you into his office. He would make you sit. He would stand over you. He'd holler in your face. He was a tall guy. He was good at getting what he wanted in Congress. And so the Great Society that he's going to propose, this sort of series of programs, are going to be incredibly effective. So he's going to declare the war on poverty. And the war on poverty itself will have several programs that are part of that. So he's going to establish Medicaid and Medicare to provide health care for those who are poor, that's Medicaid, and for the elderly who might not have enough money for their own health care based on Social Security, that's Medicare. We're going to develop model cities, so attempting to like combat that sort of ghettoization of the cities as a result of like suburbanization and white flight. The Economic Opportunity Act, which is going to try to do jobs trainings programs to help the sort of underclass, these people who are persistently unemployed despite the economic growth of the 1950s and 60s. And under the Economic Opportunity Act, we're also going to see funding for preschool programs, so the creation of Head Start, which is free preschool for low-income families. It's modeled actually on some programs that were developed within the Mexican-American community. Job Corps, again, is a specific job training program. Vista volunteers, this is like Peace Corps, I can't remember now what it stands for, but it's like the Peace Corps for America, right? So it's like young people who are going to volunteer, they're going to get federal funding, but instead of going overseas to do these like public works programs, they're going to do them here within the country. Again, combating unemployment, right, and among young people by giving them this other opportunity, this other thing they can do, while also like having these like renewal projects. The food stamps will be created. Education, more broadly speaking, is going to be funded in a bigger way. So like the federal government is going to begin to get involved in public education. You might not realize that this is not in the Constitution, but it's not, right? There's nowhere in the Constitution that gives the federal government authority to be involved in education. But Johnson is going to really expand that program with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That's going to include things like more funding for math and science programs, more funding for early elementary business. I guess backing up while we're here, I don't know that we talked out loud, but I want to make sure that you have taken note from your textbook. In the 1940s, the National Defense Education Act, which was passed right after the launching of Sputnik. And so the National Defense Education Act really significantly grew. It wasn't federal involvement in education in terms of like designing programs or curriculum, but federal funding for education to improve the teaching of math and science, because there was this real fear that the Soviets were winning the space race, right? If they've gotten Sputnik, if they've got the first satellite, then we've got to catch up somehow. We must not be smart enough, or we must not be educated enough. So anyway, that was sort of the first real foray into education. But Johnson's going to significantly expand that. He's going to develop mass transportation systems, trying to improve like mobility within big cities. And then in civil rights, Johnson is going to be perhaps the most active president to try to advance the cause of civil rights, which is going to meet him with a lot of resistance and lose the South for the Democratic Party, right? So in 1968, after Johnson finishes his single term in office, the South will never again vote for the Democrats, like ever to now anyway. His efforts for civil rights will cost the Democratic Party in many ways, and so it's no surprise that Johnson is really the last of the sort of line of Democratic presidents, and then we kind of get this sort of like gray area for a while, and then we see the rise of conservatism. So we're going to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We're going to see the passage of the 24th Amendment, which is going to be on poll taxes. We're going to pass the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is for the very first time going to roll back some of those nativist policies of the 1920s, raising quotas, reducing restrictions on immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, from Southeast Asia. So we're finally going to see sort of this demographic change. He's going to pass the Higher Education Act to provide more funding for universities, establishing the Pell Grant program. We're going to get involved in environmental protections, right? So the 1960s are going to see the growth of like the environmental movement, the Wilderness Preservation Act, the establishment of consumer protection, like the Truth in Packaging Act. And this is just a tiny sampling of the kinds of things that were going on in the Great Society. So we'll talk more about that on Thursday. And that's it.